If your car makes clicking noises while you turn, then your CV axle is worn out. Now here I have a CV axle. Over time, this rubber boot here will crack and split open, and this will allow water and debris to get in, and all the grease to come out. So over time the bearings inside will wear out. If the boot split and it's clicking, then you must change the CV axle as soon as possible. If you don't, then something catastrophic will happen to your transmission. The small clicking sounds will turn into large clunks, and when it seizes up during a turn, it will destroy your transmission. So here's my old transmission from my old car as proof. To change your drive axle, you'll need some tools, an impact gun if you have it, and some impact sockets, and a socket set, one of these larger sockets for the hub nut, a pry bar, a really large breaker bar, hammer, a rubber mallet, a large puller, a torque wrench, jack, and a jack stand. You can refer to my previous video on how to raise a car and remove and install a wheel. Because today I have an impact gun, I'll be doing things a little bit different. Let's start off by removing the hub nut, and here there's a little slot that I can pry it open with. And that's your hub nut. Okay, once you hear that break, don't loosen it anymore. Because I'm using an impact gun, I can raise the vehicle up and take the lug nuts off without worrying about the wheel slipping or putting torque on a transmission. But because I have a special lug nut here, this one here that uses a special key to take it off, I have to do it manually. So for this one, I will raise the car up partially to take some pressure off the tire. And now I can raise the vehicle all the way up and then use an impact gun to take the rest of them out. Because I know I'll be working underneath the car, I'll be using both the jack and the jack stand for support. So I'll lower the car right onto this jack stand. So lower it just until it touches. So right now it's pretty secure. And just to be safe, I put a second jack stand underneath the frame of the car. Now I will detach the brake line from the suspension by removing this bolt. There's actually a second bolt that's holding the brake line on the suspension, so you can remove that as well. I'll remove the cotter pin and loosen the castle nut on the lower ball joint. And there's your cotter pin. Make sure when you put the cotter pin back, you use a new one. Don't use the old ones. Now I'll loosen the castle nut. Remove the hub nut. So normally you're supposed to use a impact socket on with an impact gun, but because I don't have one and this is all I got, I'll just use this. The socket is large enough and it's strong enough, so it's not going to do much damage to it, and this is the only thing I use the socket for. Remove this bolt and nut that's holding the suspension fork to the lower control arm. And now I can tap the bolt through. Before that, I've got to put this nut back on before I tap it. That way I won't damage the threads. You also need to remove the pinch bolt that's on the fork. And remove the fork from the suspension. Okay, so now I want to push the drive axle through the hub, and to do this I would thread the hub nut back on and then use a rubber mallet and hammer it through. If the rubber mallet doesn't work, then you can use a hammer. Loosen it a bit more and then hammer it through more. Okay, at this point I know that the drive axle is not seized onto the hub, so I can leave that for now until, or pop the ball joint out from the lower control arm. Okay, what I'm doing now, I left the castle nut on the ball joint. So I'm using a castle nut as a thread protector, so when I'm using a puller to try to push the ball joint out, it'll protect the threads. Now if the puller doesn't do a perfect job and it's hard to get it out, then you can do what most guys do, take a hammer and then hit the lower control arm right there where the ball joint goes through, and that should pop the ball joint out. Here I have a piece of wood between the jack and the rotor, and the wood's to protect the rotor when I'm raising the whole assembly up. So what I'm trying to do is raise the assembly while prying the ball joint out of the lower control arm. And as I pull the whole assembly free, tap the remaining portion of the drive axle out. Now the drive axle is out of the hub. Here I have a wire suspending the whole assembly so that I can work around it. Since I have everything opened, I'll check the ball joints to see if they have any play in them. If they do have any play, you're looking at probably a millimeter or so. If you do feel that there's any play, you should change the ball joints. So what I would do is try and just wiggle it around, see if there's any play at all, and use a big pair of pliers like this to squeeze it to see if there's any play. I don't feel any, so these ball joints are probably still okay. Here I got a wire suspending the drive axle, so when I pop it out, it doesn't just drop on me. What I'm trying to do here is to pry the CV axle away from this portion of the shaft. The drive shaft was really hard to remove from the secondary shaft right here, and prying wasn't easy, so what I did was put a big nut here. I put a nut right here, and I wedged a small pry bar between the nut and this piece right here, the drive axle, and I hammered the crowbar in between them to force the drive axle out. And now I can pull the drive axle out. The axle on this side of the car attaches to a secondary shaft and then the transmission, but on the other side of the car, the drive shaft connects directly to the transmission. So when you take the axle out on the other side, make sure you have an oil pan underneath, because once you pull the axle out, some transmission fluid might flow. You support one end of the drive axle with a wire, and then you can manipulate the other end. You want to slide it in so that it lines up with the splines, and push it in until you hear a click. I'm sliding the drive axle in until you can hear the click. Before I put the CV axle back through the hub, I put some anti-seize grease on the splines. Once you push the axle back into the transmission or the secondary drive shaft, install the suspension fork. So make sure you tighten and torque the pinch bolt on the fork, and also the bolt that connects the fork to the lower control arm. Unfortunately, my camera battery died when I was doing this, but once your fork is installed, pivot the whole hub assembly so that you can push the drive axle through the hub. And once you have it through the hub, take your large hub nut and thread it through to stop it from pulling back out. Once you've done that, you lift this whole hub assembly and allow the ball joint underneath to fall into the lower control arm. Once the ball joint falls through the lower control arm, tighten and torque the castle nut and replace the old cotter pin with a new one. For now, just lightly tighten this hub nut with a socket until you put the wheel back on and lower the car. Now I will remount the wheel, hand tighten the lug nuts, lower the vehicle until the tire just touches the ground. Use a torque wrench and torque down the hub nut. The hub nut on my car requires 134 foot-pounds, so I've adjusted the torque wrench to 134. To raise the vehicle back up, remove the wheel and stake down the portion of the hub nut onto the drive axle so the hub nut won't slip. As you can see, the flange on the nut is staked into the indentation on the drive axle. Okay, now I can reinstall the wheel and lower the car back down. Okay, now that the car is lowered, just remove the wheel blocks and you're done.